Welcome back, and now for the news in detail. In the Democratic Republic of Congo, 24 people, including 17 passengers and 2 crew members, have been killed in a plane crash in the city of Goma. The passenger jet crashed into houses after taking off from a nearby airport. Air accidents are relatively frequent in Congo because of poor safety standards and maintenance. All Congolese commercial carriers are banned from operating in the European Union. In Afghanistan, the Taliban claim a U.S. airstrike on a mosque has killed 17 civilians and wounded 8 others in Farah province. They said children were among those killed. Rejecting the claim, the Afghan Defense Ministry said 11 Taliban fighters were killed in the strike. U.S. Special Inspector General for Afghanistan Reconstruction says there have been 30 inside attacks in Afghan forces in the past 3 months. In a report, SIGAR said twice as many attacks had taken place from June to August than the last quarter. The report said there were 19 attacks, killing 87 Afghan security personnel between February and May. It says there were 49 total attacks this year, resulting in 167 casualties. The report says 56 more members of the Afghan National Defense Forces were killed than last year. The Afghanistan Independent Election Commission says it will call the government to intervene if the recounting process continues to be opposed. The Election Commission said their offices are currently closed in 7 provinces because of the boycott by the election team members. The Election Commission spokesperson Mirza Haqparast said it will be forced to invoke constitutional provisions calling for the government intervention. He said the body will ask for the government's cooperation to implement the election process in 7 provinces. Chief Executive Abdullah and 10 other candidates have boycotted the recount, demanding the exclusion of the fraudulent votes. Pakistan's Foreign Minister Shah Mahmood Qureshi says a Washington stance on the China-Pakistan Economic Corridor won't have any impact on the project. U.S. Assistant Secretary of State Alice Wells said CPEC would further add to Pakistan's debt burden. Speaking in Multan, Qureshi said Pakistan doesn't agree with the views expressed by the top U.S. diplomat. Qureshi said CPEC is mandatory for the development of Pakistan. He said the project is a game changer for the region, and any country, including the US, can invest in economic zones being established under CPEC. Earlier, Pakistan's Ministry for Planning also rejected Washington's concern. Congressman Brad Sherman has sought President Donald Trump's assistance to arrange a visit of the U.S. diplomats to Indian-occupied Kashmir. In a letter to Assistant Secretary Alice Wells, Sherman said U.S. diplomats must be allowed to see the situation on the ground. The congressman said he is concerned about the state of human rights in the valley because of the information blackout of the region. He said India previously stopped U.S. diplomats from visiting the valley but allowed certain European Parliament members to go there. He asked Wells to share the reasons given by New Delhi for refusing permission to the U.S. diplomats. Sherman also asked Wells to provide details of a classified hearing from the State Department regarding Indian-occupied Kashmir. Iraqi security forces have killed 5 more protesters in crackdowns on demonstrations in the cities of Basra and Syria. Police say at least 4 were killed and 70 others wounded after forces used live rounds to disperse the protesters near Basra's key port. In Syria, medics said at least 3 people were killed and over 50 wounded as troops tried to end protesters' blockade of bridges. Medics say Iraqi security forces also wounded at least 24 people in Karbala overnight after opening fire on the protesters. The protesters were trying to approach the local government headquarters. Over 330 people have been killed since mass unrest broke out in Baghdad and southern Iraq in early October. The US has asked Facebook and Twitter to suspend all accounts belonging to Iranian leadership until Tehran restores internet services in the country. Iran imposed a near total internet blackout more than a week ago amid violent protests. In an interview, US Special Representative for Iran, Brian Hook says Tehran is a deeply hypocritical regime. He said Tehran has shut down the internet for its people while its government continues to use social media to further its agenda. Hook said social media platforms must ban accounts of Supreme Leader Khamenei, Foreign Minister Jawad Zarif and President Hassan Rouhani. The latest news reports have said Iran is slowly lifting the ban on the internet after curbing the protests. Moscow says Iran has sought a loan of $2 billion from Russia to build its infrastructure. A Russian energy minister, Alexander Novak, said Tehran made requests for loans to build power plants, railroads, and to purchase subway cars. Earlier, Iran's parliament allowed the country's government to request a loan of $5 billion from Russia. Iranian Transport and Urban Development Minister Mohammad Islami said $3 billion are required to build the north-south transport corridor. Yemen's government claims it has regained control of the areas in western Marib province after clashes with the Houthi militias. State media says both sides are still engaged in fierce fighting in the area. It said both sides suffered multiple casualties, while many were wounded during the battle. The renewed clashes comes a day after UN envoy Martin Griffiths said airstrikes by Yemen's coalition have dropped by nearly 80%. Griffiths told the Security Council there was a reduction in aggression and the country was perhaps moving towards an overall ceasefire. Forces loyal to General Haftar have announced a no-fly zone over western Libya as the battle for the capital Tripoli continues. LNA spokesman Ahmad al-Mismari said the decision has been taken as a result of advancement of their forces into the capital. Al-Mismari said it is necessary to warn the aviation authority and all airline companies using this area. The spokesman said any suspicious target that threatens the safety of the people will be fired upon. The announcement comes a few days after an Italian drone was shot down by the LNA. Israelis have gathered in protest against their Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu in major cities. In Jerusalem and Tel Aviv, dozens of protesters called for Netanyahu's resignation. Blue and White Party head Benny Gantz said Netanyahu is threatening a civil war with his call for incitement.
In recent weeks, the right are left with no room for doubt. Netanyahu is threatening a civil war with his calls of incitement. I stand here in front of you in the name of many people on the right and left and say it's time to heal Israeli society from the plague of hatred.
Benjamin Netanyahu was indicted on charges of bribery, fraud and breach of trust in a set of long-running corruption cases. Now moving on, the people of Hong Kong are voting in the city's first local elections since the violent demonstrations broke out 5 months ago. 452 councillor seats are up for grabs in the polls. The government says the turnout has been 3 times higher than the 2015 district council polls. A record number of over 4 million citizens have registered to cast their ballot. Protests have been muted recently to avoid delaying polls as pro-democracy figures urged citizens to vote.
I urge more people around the world to stand with Hong Kong, and more Hong Kongers should come out to vote. District council election is the election in more community-based, focused on more district or constitution issue instead of overall Hong Kong political system reform.
The pro-democracy camp is calling the polls a referendum on Chief Executive Carrie Lam, who has rejected the demands of the protesters. Now moving on, Pope Francis has called on all the world leaders to abolish all nuclear weapons, calling their possession perverse and indefensible. He is on a first papal visit to Japan in nearly 4 decades. Francis asked political leaders to remove their nuclear reliance as it cannot protect the public from threats. The pontiff is scheduled to meet with Japan's Emperor Naruhito and Prime Minister Shinzo Abe. On Monday, Francis will meet victims of the 2011 tsunami and Fukushima nuclear meltdown. More stories to follow, but right after a short break. Stay tuned. Welcome back. The death toll from a measles outbreak in the Pacific island of Samoa rose to 22 over the past week. Samoan authorities declared a measles epidemic in late October. Around 1,800 new measles cases were also identified by the Samoan government. Children are most vulnerable to the outbreak. All but one of the deceased are children under the age of 5. Until last week, the measles death toll stood at only 6. UNICEF has delivered over 110,000 measles vaccines to the island nation. 65 people have been killed by floods across Central and Eastern Africa after heavy rains triggered landslides and caused rivers to burst their banks. Local media says heavy rain have lashed the East African region for the past 30 days. 25 people were killed in the Congos, while nearly 40 people have died in Kenya and Tanzania. The Congolese government has declared a state of emergency in the province of Equator after the disaster struck. Local authorities said over 180,000 people are in need of humanitarian assistance in the region. They said various diseases and epidemics are being feared in the aftermath of the floods. In Ethiopia, the people of Sidama Zone, the largest ethnic group, have voted to form their own self-governing region. The polls were conducted after the country's ethnic groups demanded greater autonomy under sweeping reforms led by Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed. Ethiopia's electoral board said provisional results show over 98% of the voters backed the change. The result grants the Sidama people their own self-governing region and control over the local taxes, education, security, and certain legislation. Electoral Board's Deputy Chairman, Wubishat Aile, said the referendum was completed in a peaceful manner with a good turnout.
The Sidama referendum has been completed legally in a peaceful manner based on the decision of the residents of the region through their ballot. Sidama has obtained the necessary vote to become a regional government on its own. The procedure of the referendum was peaceful, credible, and one that saw a huge number of voter turnout.
After the result was announced, people gathered in Hawassa's central square to sing and dance, celebrating their victory. The Sidama ethnicity represents about 4% of Ethiopia's 110 million population. Now moving on, Romanians are voting today in the second and final round of the presidential election. Incumbent President Klaus Iohannis won the first round with 39% of the vote. Pre-poll surveys show Iohannis is ahead of his rival, former Prime Minister Viorica Dăncilă. Under Iohannis' government, Romania rolled back anti-corruption measures and weakened the independence of the courts. Iohannis has promised to end corruption and better relations with the European Union. He said Romanians are leading the process of changing the country for the better after winning the first round. In France, thousands of Yellow Vest protesters have taken to the streets for the 54th consecutive week of mass demonstrations. Protests started last year in November in reaction to rising fuel costs and economic injustice, but later spiraled into deadly anti-government riots. Protesters gathered at Estienne d'Auvers Square and marched towards Philippe Square. Police banned protests in Champs-Élysées around Notre Dame Cathedral and increased security in the area. The French government says demonstrations have left 11 people dead and more than 4,000 injured since they began. In Paris, thousands of protesters have demanded more government investment into the prevention of domestic violence. Violence attacks on women by their partners and ex-partners has been a major issue in France. French President Emmanuel Macron once termed the problem France's shame.
France is generally considered a progressive country that pushes for women's rights worldwide. But it also has one of the highest rates of domestic violence in Europe. 130 French women have been killed by their partners or ex-partners in 2019 alone.
Moi, je sais qu'en tant que travailleur social, quand les femmes vont déposer plainte, elles ne sont pas du tout bien reçues par la gendarmerie. Il faudrait que les gendarmes soient formés à prendre les plaintes. Et, c'est même ça, limite, qui les pousse à ne pas porter plainte parce qu'elles savent très bien comment elles vont être reçues. Donc il y a toute une histoire de formation à faire derrière.
This protest is aimed at pressuring the French government before it unveils new measures against the problem on Monday. The new steps include seizing firearms from people suspected of domestic violence, as well as providing police with better training on how to deal with cases of domestic abuse.
C'est une question de culture, hein. C'est une question de culture, donc ça commence dès l'école. Et évidemment, à l'école, on a eu une offensive de l'extrême droite assez forte ces 10 dernières années.
A 2014 survey of 42,000 women in the EU revealed 26% of French respondents had been abused by a partner. This is below the global average of 30%, but the sixth highest among European nations.
Lows in the highs of the business world now. The US says an initial trade agreement with China is still possible by the end of the year. Speaking in Halifax, US National Security Advisor Robert O'Brien said the Phase 1 deal is in the pipeline, but he tied the probability of a deal with China's activities in Hong Kong, the South China Sea and other parts of the world. Earlier, President Donald Trump said he had told Chinese President Xi Jinping that Beijing's handling of the Hong Kong protests will affect the trade deal. President Xi Jinping says Beijing wants to reach a preliminary trade deal with the US but is not afraid to fight back when necessary. And now the weather situation from around the globe. And that's all for now. For the latest updates, you can follow us on social media at Indus.News.